from MCIE.
Hey y'all, just a content warning about today's episode. Depictions of the living conditions of institutions for people with disabilities in the 1960s will be discussed, as well as certain attitudes about people with disabilities that work there. Early in her career, Carol Quirk, CEO of MCIE, worked in institutions, first as a consultant and then as a psychologist. When she first opened the book Unsilenced, A Teacher's Year of Battles, Breakthroughs, and Life-Changing Lessons at Belchertown State School by Howard Shane, memories of her experience began flooding back.
Drab visually, where you're seeing human beings in states that you would not want your own person, relative. The smells of people who are not bathed well enough. On top of that, whatever disinfectant might be used, the sounds of people moaning and groaning and calling out and shrieking and laughing. It's shocking. It's shocking. And then the other part for me is how we warehoused human beings and treating people in ways that we would not, to this day, we would not treat animals that way. That would not be acceptable. Those are all things that kept coming to me as I was reading his book.
But if one good thing came out of working at these institutions, it put her on a path to advocate for inclusion for people with disabilities.
It had a definite and significant role on where I ended up. The first time I was working in an institution, I was working for a state agency, and as part of this agency, I was very young. I can't believe they let me do this. We were consultants around supporting people with developmental and intellectual disabilities related to problem behavior. And so I was asked to go to Southbury Training School to work with the residential supervisors who each supervised what they called cottage, because you lived in a building called a cottage, even though there was nothing cottage-like related to it. And they were supposed to learn behavioral strategies so they could teach their cottage attendants how to support problem behavior or use teaching strategies. So I was there. I ended up staying on campus. They had housing for people who were visiting and taught behavioral strategies. Each person had to take one resident who they were going to apply what they were learning. And then they also had to take one cottage and do something as a group that would improve the lives of the people who lived there. And a psychologist who was there and kind of my monitor, who was monitoring what I was doing, he kept saying the only reason you can do what you're doing, because they were wildly successful at making change, but let me tell you, it wasn't hard. But the only reason you can do what you're doing is because you're from the outside. And some of the changes were things like, in this dining room, when you bring all the residents who lived in the cottage there, they had to have clothes on and they had to have forks as well as spoons. And they had to have their whole meal all at once and not bring the roll out, bring the plate out, bring the milk out. And the third thing was that the attendants couldn't yell. So those were the three interventions: fork as well as spoon, meal all at once, and nobody yells. Wildly successful. So I just couldn't believe that, this guy who was a psychologist there, why couldn't he do what I was doing? And he was older than me, more experienced than me. And I had to believe that you could make change from the inside. So I deliberately sought a position in an institution. And I was qualified as a psychologist. So I got a job in an institution in North Carolina as a psychologist. One of the first people who was under my supervision was a young woman who spent 23 out of 24 hours in a straitjacket. And she couldn't really speak. She could speak a few words. She had severe self-injury and used a wheelchair when she was out of the straitjacket because she couldn't walk because she didn't exercise. Within a year and a half, she was walking, using words, dressing herself, feeding herself, and attending the school that was on the grounds. But that influence was personal, just like Howard Shane's influence was very personal and didn't change the system. And I was not changing the system. And I saw that I could make change in the lives of a few people, but I was not in any position to tell anybody, certainly all those people above me, what to do. So I came to the conclusion that the only way to make change was to have that high level of influence, or be from the outside, where you could come in and act in a way that gave a responsibility to the people who were there, who had it, but influence them to make the changes to better lives of people with disabilities. And so I knew I had to learn things. I had to learn about systems change. I had to learn about how to run a business. I had to learn about budgeting. I had to learn about what worked, what are the strategies, the teaching strategies. So I moved over and took more, I got my doctorate, took coursework in education and business in order to figure out how to do something different to make a difference.
So yeah, it really did. It really did put you on the path you are now.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So what would you want anyone who's listening to this interview or reading Howard's book, like what would you want them to learn from this experience, from your descriptions and from Howard's story?
I think I would want them to think about the assumptions they make about people with obvious disabilities, especially when they see them in a group. In both institutions, I was in residential facilities, the units or the cottages, and the descriptions that I gave you about people moaning, groaning, moving, rocking. I saw young people eating threads that they tore off their sheets or off their clothing. This is contrasted with several years later, after this experience, I went to a conference, and it was specifically for autistic people who used augmentative communication or alternative communication or typed. And there were very few non-autistic people other than the helpers, whether it was a family member who brought them or a aide or somebody, a service provider. So I'd say nearly 50% of the people in attendance were not only autistic, but were severely impacted in terms of their communication and behavior. And I stood there, and they were all doing the same things that I saw in the institution behaviorally. And these are communicators, maybe in alternative ways, but people who express their thoughts and choices and interests. And that hit me like a blow. What had we done as a humanity, where we were warehousing these people, making an assumption that they didn't care, they didn't understand, they had no cognitive ability. And that is not true. How many of them were actually autistic people who couldn't communicate? And so I think I know this is a long way to get to it, but the thing that I would want people to think about in today's world, when we put students with significant cognitive disabilities in a separate classroom for the majority of the day, when you look at what they're doing, you can see children who are not readers, probably, who are bare communicators, who are thought not to be able to achieve grade level curriculum, and maybe they won't ever. But our whole assumption about who they are once they're in a group is to other them and think of them as less capable, less knowing, and our expectations drop. And they don't get the exposure to the social opportunities, let alone the academic. I know that Howard said in his interview that we have to think about times, it's not all about inclusion. We have to think about times when we can teach the specific things that a person might need, especially if they need alternate communication. There may be other learning needs. And I agree that for many people, there may be that intensive time for specific instruction, but inclusion is not just about place, as we always talk about at MCIE. Yes, you may have those times for very specific, unique instruction, but inclusion is really about those relationships and opportunities to experience what the rest of humanity is experiencing.
My name is Tim Villegas, and you are listening to the Think Inclusive podcast presented by MCIE. This podcast exists to build bridges between families, educators, and disability rights advocates to create a shared understanding of inclusive education and what inclusion looks like in the real world. To find out more about who we are and what we do, check us out at thinkinclusive.us or on the socials, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Also, take our podcast listener survey. Your responses will help us develop a better podcast experience. Go to bit.ly/TI podcast survey to submit your responses. We appreciate it. Today on the podcast, we talk to Howard Shane, author of the book Unsilenced. He is also an associate professor at the Harvard Medical School and the director of the Autism Language Program at Boston Children's Hospital. We talk about what it was like to work at Belchertown State School, an institution for people with disabilities in the 1960s. We also highlight some of the stories from his book, including how some of his students used an early form of augmentative and alternative communication. Thanks so much for listening. I'm glad you're here. And now, our interview with Howard Shane. Today on the Think Inclusive podcast, we have Dr. Howard Shane, who is an associate professor at the Harvard Medical School and the director of the Autism Language Program at Boston Children's Hospital. He has designed more than a dozen computer applications used widely by persons with disabilities and holds 2 U.S. patents. Howard has received the honors of the Association Distinction for the American Speech and Hearing Association, to which he is a fellow. And in 2019, he was the recipient of the Frank F. Kleffner Lifetime Clinical Career Award. Dr. Shane has also received the Goldenson Award for Innovations in Technology from the United Cerebral Palsy Association, and authored numerous papers and chapters on severe speech impairment, lectured throughout the world on the topic, and produced numerous computer-based innovations enjoyed by persons with complex communication disorders. Howard Shane, welcome to the Think Inclusive podcast.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Well, I would love it if you would introduce yourself to our audience of educators and families of children with disabilities. We're going to talk about your book that you wrote called Unsilenced, but maybe people don't know who you are. So would you spend a couple minutes introducing yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm Howard Shane, as you mentioned, and I've been at the Boston Children's Hospital for the past 44 years. Where I've had the opportunity to see, I estimate, over 10,000 children in our clinics. My focus ever since I started out as a teacher at the Belchertown State School in 1969, my professional's focus has really been working with children who are, have what we would consider minimally verbal, a lot of other terms, sometimes nonverbal, non-speaking, and so forth, but children with significant, complex communication problems.
Could you set the stage a little bit on what actually the living conditions were like in Belchertown when you first arrived?
Well, I think it's important to understand me as a person back then. I had just graduated from college. I had a minor in education. I was going to be a history teacher. And at the time and in the where I was living, there were no jobs in history, teaching, a history teacher in a high school. And the only job in education that was available was at the Belchertown State School. I was, accepted basically by a phone call. I had no preparation. I did have a minor in education, but I didn't have preparation to work with individuals who had, would considered having a disability. So I arrive at Belchertown. I meet the director of education. I go to the infirmary building where I was going to be the teacher. And I walked in, and the moment I walked into the building, my life changed. It was, you were assaulted by the odor, you were assaulted by the noise. And then we did a tour of the building, and I saw, young children living in a dormitory style, but 30 people in a room. They were in iron beds or cribs. The women on the first floor, men on the second floor, of all ages. And it was just nothing I had ever encountered, and even imagined existed. I was a pretty naive 22-year-old guy.
So you did have some training to be a teacher, although, like you said, this was the job that was available, right?
Yes.
So in the book, you talk about using students' interests to guide them to learn. Was that something that was explicitly taught to you, or was that just innate, or something that you thought was a good idea and you went with it?
Well, there was no real curriculum for me that had been designed. And I knew that from my own, the way I approach life, when it's something of interest, it makes a significant difference to the way you approach it, the way you learn about it. And I just felt that would be important in my way of teaching. At the time, I had also just finished reading the book Summerhill, which many people aren't aware of, but it was a philosophy that was started in England by A.S. Neal. And basically, he was taking troubled teenagers, and he created this school called Summerhill. And he took their interests, and he was able to design a personalized curriculum based on their own interests. One person stood out was a troubled youth who was interested in automobiles and mechanics, and his whole curriculum was around that. And it was clear to me that I could, do the same thing, or at least approach it that way at Belchertown. And so I tried to incorporate that kind of thinking. And I think that it's a way of approaching education that's followed me throughout my career.
Yeah, yeah, and I would say there's a lot of people saying that now, right? So
Yeah.
it definitely, that idea has grown as almost a best practice, or is a best practice in education. So
Yeah, and I think we're beginning to see that, Howard Gardner's work on multiple intelligences, that people are simply different. And if we can tap into and better understand where their interests and strengths are, we can build upon that. And knowing that life experiences and what you're going to do and enjoy, in part, is obviously shaped by the things that you're interested in, and everybody's different.
let's talk about making change. How long were you at Belchertown?
A year.
A year. Okay. So in that year, do you feel like you were able to make change from the inside the institution, or did you feel like in hindsight, when you left, you were able to make more change?
I think that this was the beginning of the deinstitutionalization movement. And I think the impact I had was some communication that I had with the Springfield Union in giving them information about what I thought was, in the injustices that situation. But clearly, leaving the institution and getting myself, becoming more educated, I left. And ultimately, a few years later, I went to Syracuse and worked with Dr. Burton Blatt, who was the Dean of Education. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Some of our your listeners might be. But he had written a book called Christmas in Purgatory, where he went into institutions with a camera and then wrote a beautiful poetic anthology. And I was part of his institute for basically deinstitutionalization, and that plus working with Dr. Ruth Lencioni, who was was a specialist in cerebral palsy communication. It was kind of a perfect fit for me, and I had the opportunity to then meet with like-minded people. Mm. At Burt Blatt's Center on Human Policy. It was a very exciting time because we were right at the threshold of change. And then Wolf Wolfensberger joined the faculty. And so it was a very exciting time to be there.
Your time at Belchertown really set your trajectory, right, towards making change. And then all the skills that you have brought with, developing programs for communication and for improving the lives of people with disabilities. Do you think you would have gone into this area if you, let's say you didn't get that job at Belchertown and you did get a job as a history teacher? How different would your life be?
I think my life would have been completely different. I'd like to think that I would have been a history teacher and would have liked it, but maybe I would have become bored. I mean, it's so hard to predict. Once I got to Belchertown and once I accepted where I was and what I was doing, it became an obsessive focus. I don't know if I would have been as excited about some, history. Not that it isn't exciting. I don't know, maybe I would have sold encyclopedias or, sold cars or something. I mean, I just don't know. But they definitely set the trajectory. Family, friends will say to me now, you're doing the same thing you were doing at Belchertown, only the opportunities are different. Along came technology in the early 80s, that sort of confluence of deinstitutionalization and the computer revolution gave me and others an opportunity to sort of invent and to start to create different types of communication applications and hardware and so forth. So that was something that was, really unique and important to me.
A story in the book that I really love is how you describe the communication system that you made. It was a clock, right? It was a clock, and so I don't know. I maybe you could describe it for our listeners, because it reminded me of it was obviously early technology, and I think it was the first technology, right, of how a person could select something and then visually scanning. So why don't you explain it? Because I'm not going to be able to explain it the way that you could.
Well, it was. It occurred to me that in looking at a second hand on a watch, where the second hand was pointing to numbers, that why couldn't you point to letters or point to pictures and so forth? And with that in mind, I just put a template on an old clock, and we took off the hour and minute hand and just had the second hand going around. And then from there, I worked with some university students and a professor at the engineering school at UMass. And we began to build something that allowed this type of what later became known as scanning and controlling, and using a mercury switch attached to the wrist. By turning your wrist, it completed the circuit, and it would start or stop this light going around the circumference of a circle. So it's also kind of a historical look at the beginning of AAC. Now, I don't want to claim that I'm the first person that ever thought about, something like that. There was work going on in other places, but, we just weren't in touch with each other. But eventually it became what's now known as augmentative and alternative communication. And, then I was part of the formation of the name, augmentative and alternative communication, and got to know other people. And then it became a small industry of mom and pop stores. And now, we take an iPad, developed by Apple, and we can, create, incredible opportunities, or using an Apple Watch. So, by just kind of staying in touch with consumer products and watching the development of technology, all of this just grew.
Let's talk about the future, because you saw this technology and you said, I could use this. I can use this to help students communicate, tell me what they want, make choices, stuff like that. Okay. So, as we've grown in technology and our capability, like, what do you see as our future? Right? Like, what are some things that we could look forward to as expanding on this communication capability for people with disabilities?
Well, I know that this wonderful podcast that you've created is about inclusion, and if I just take that theme and I think about technology, there's technology of the future, and some of the future's here, but I think can have a real bearing on inclusion. So, for example, right now we just finished some studies using the Apple Watch as a way of delivering cues to children on the autism spectrum. So we compared the ability to read an Apple Watch when you receive a cue to looking at that cue being delivered by an iPad, and we found that they were comparable. And then we did a small study to get children to be able to deal with the sensation of wearing an Apple Watch. And then we did a study on usability, where they could interpret the haptic or auditory cue of the watch and be able to receive the cue itself. Being able to do that gives an opportunity for things such as what I would call social pragmatic mentoring. So a child has some behaviors that the teacher or a family would like to reduce in the community. Well, how about just sending them a cue rather than saying, hey, Johnny, stop flapping your hands, or you're standing too close, or you're chewing with your mouth open. Why not just send them a very subtle cue? Well, we're working on those skills, but let's give them the reminders, but let's not call attention to them. So little things like that. Smaller, more wearable AAC technology, better voices, more childlike voices, more natural voices. I'm picturing artificial intelligence. Our behaviorists are getting better at being able to analyze behavior and trying to improve it, but we miss the mark sometimes. Well, what if we were just monitoring, the heart rate or galvanic skin responses because a child is getting anxious, and we see that, and we notice in advance. So rather than letting that behavior escalate, we get that reading, and we throw them in the ball pit and let them relax. So I think that the future is going to allow that to happen. Artificial intelligence is going to be able to capture. The human mind just can't deal with so many variables to sometimes be able to predict what's going to happen. But just imagine that, I had Wheaties for breakfast. Well, maybe there's gluten there. And then there's all these other little things that happen that all gets captured. And then the AI is kind of contemplating all this. And maybe we can begin to get better understanding of why that behavior is what it is. So I'm just looking at, those kinds of opportunities. So, the future is, and they're going to be it's consumer based. They're not going to be, specialized equipment. They're going to be really consumer based materials. in my clinical office, I had two posters. One was Jefferson Airplane, and one was Jefferson Starship. And folks would often ask me about those, and are you a great Jefferson Airplane fan? I said, well, they had good music, but it was a constant reminder to me that you have to evolve from being an airplane to being the Starship. And that's what it's been for me for 52 years, I guess, is just moving from a airplane to a Starship, and it just continues. And believe me, it's just my ability to just see what's available, and just my obsessive nature, looking at how could I turn this into something that's going to help a child who can't speak, or has a behavior problem, or just trying to change behavior.
Yeah, so you really see the consumer market for computers, watches, whatever smart technology, AI, as we're going to be using technology that's available for everyone.
Right.
But certain people can use aspects of that technology to make life more accessible. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. And, this work going on, we have a project going on now with augmented reality, where we're trying to teach language concepts. And I use augmented reality to take a farm scene, and I want to teach the concept of pushing. So I have the farmer, pushing the wagon, but I build that little sentence, and then that scene becomes alive as I'm looking through my iPad screen. I mean, there's just so much in the way of excitement, and children with disabilities, children in general, are drawn to the screen. So why don't we use that as a medium to teach? And not that I don't want to make it sound like I'm the only person. The world is filled with people who are doing exciting work.
Right.
And I just am so enamored with it all.
Let's talk a little bit more about our educational system as it stands right now. And I'm wondering if you see the system as two separate systems, right? Special education, general education, and I'd love to know your thoughts about how we can improve that. Like, whether is it just a matter of like, well, we just got to improve special education services so that they're more inclusive and they have more technology and stuff like that, or is it really we need another system? I guess that's my question.
I think we need a different philosophical orientation. I mean, I think we start with language. I mean, just calling it special education, and maybe even the word inclusion. I mean, I just think that what we need to be looking at is an educational approach where every child is obviously you want to have they want to be with other children to the maximum degree possible, but if we call them substantially separate or segregated classrooms, I mean, it's that kind of language which I think is just all wrong. I think that we want children to be together, but part of it is a philosophy where children are just seen as children, and maybe it's a utopian dream. But I'm reminded of a book I read a number of years ago by Nora Gross. It was called "Everybody Here Spoke Sign Language," and it's about the deaf community on Martha's Vineyard. That before it became what Martha's Vineyard is now, as a vacation land, it was a lot of people from a particular region in England came to Martha's Vineyard, and they had a dominant gene that led to a lot of deafness. So a vast majority of people on Martha's Vineyard signed. And in the book, the interviewer is talking to this woman who experienced that. And she asked about some person, Jack Jones. What about Jack Jones? Said, oh, he was this tall guy with red hair and freckles, and he was very strong. And then the interviewer, Nora, said, well, wasn't he deaf? And she said, oh, yeah, he was deaf. That's when we're going to clearly have, in an inclusive philosophy. So, how do we go about that? I don't know the answer to that, but I think that we start with children being in classrooms, and just as you get called out, you're going to go to band or you're going to go to some program. So you go off and you do some specialized reading, and just letting children be together as much as possible. But at the same time, we have to be realistic that there are learning differences, and you can't just throw children who have significant learning difficulties or who are minimally verbal, just putting them into a class and expect them to be learning. But there are ways of maximizing their interactions, bringing them into situations where they're learning and then letting them experience that. But at the same time, it sort of starts with, how do we get the whole school to kind of understand that? I work with a school in upstate New York as a research project, and and in their school, this is, can I mention the school itself? And
it's from me.
It's the Fayetteville Manlius School in upstate New York, and in their elementary school, one of their elementary schools where we have our a program, there are children who are in a sort of substantially separate situation, but every classroom in the school is it's O'Neill is the last teacher of the teacher. The last name of the teacher is O'Neill's Ocean, and another teacher could be Jones. Jones is Jupiter, but that's a general ed classroom. Mm-hmm. It's not this separate classroom. So I think it comes with language. It comes with all the technology opportunities. It comes with a philosophy of maximum exposure. I mean, that's the way I see it. And there's I think there's much to be done. A great deal of work in my little utopian dream, but that's how I think it should be approached.
I think a lot of people share that dream.
I hope so. Again, I this is just the way I think, and I know that there are a lot of much smarter people than me and who think about these things.
Right. Yeah, but I think that's why I am excited for our listeners to hear your story and your thoughts, because we need to share each other's dream. We need to share our dreams with each other, is what I'm trying to say. And I love the way that you're kind of framing technology as a way that our society can be more inclusive. Because I do think I think that is our future, So thank you for your thoughts about that. So as you were writing the book, was there a particular memory as you were writing that gained new significance as you wrote it? Anything that just was like, oh, now I'm remembering something different or something, more significant about it?
I think that when I was writing the book, as I was capturing moments and situations, and it was about the students, for one, and a mentor who came to my class and really became a major force in my thinking as a mentor. And I think he was the mentor that every 22-year-old needs in order to sort of understand who they are and where they're going. But as I wrote about the students, it just made me all the more fond of them and what they did for me. There's one student who became a lifelong friend. He had cerebral palsy, Ron, and we'd meet regularly, long after Belchertown. I was the best man in his wedding. We went to Red Sox games. When he finally got out and was living in the community, he was just this good guy. He couldn't speak, but he had, and so I just happened to have this clinic at Boston Children's Hospital where he'd come and get, the latest technologies. But, he was a popular person out in Western Massachusetts, and, he went to Foxwoods and he'd go drinking, and he, loved the Red Sox, and he wouldn't have had that opportunity if we still had institutions. But it made me all the more realize who these people were, and I tried to make that part of the book is is not just about the bleakness of the institution, but it's about what life was like for them, how the setting affected them. And so I guess the highlight is just how it brought to life what it was like for me there and what they were like. And so I guess that's how it just kind of came down.
Well, we appreciate you being on the podcast and talking about your book. It's fantastic. Make sure you go ahead and get a copy of Unsilenced by Dr. Howard Shane. Dr. Shane, is there anything else that you wanted to, plug? Is there, like, if someone wanted to get a hold of you and ask you questions, maybe they read the book and they really are interested in something they read, how can people get a hold of you?
They can get a hold of me. I'm at Boston Children's, howard.shane@childrens.harvard.edu. And I'm always interested in comments, good and bad. So that's, they certainly can do that. Plugging, I want to plug a project that I'm doing right now. I'm writing a children's book. It's a series of different stories about children I've seen in my clinic. And it's not about them per se, but it's about their skill set. And it's in the title, it's about my excellent superpowers. So I take children on the autism spectrum who have unusual talents, extraordinary Lego skills, and are extraordinary memory for dates and calendar events and so forth, and then write stories. It's sort of fictionalized fiction, so that other children in the class or in their environment, in their neighborhoods, can come to understand the extraordinary skills that they have. And that sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier, that if you look at everybody the kind of the talents they have and reinforce those talents and expand upon them. So these 5 stories are about individuals who have unique talents and how they use those talents productively and how it affects other people. So that's a project I'm doing now, and that hopefully will be out in 6 months to 8 months. It's being published by the American Speech and Hearing Association, their publishing house. So get on the lookout, and you absolutely need to buy that. And of course, get on your bookshelf Unsilenced.
Well, Dr. Howard Shane, thank you so much for being on the Think Inclusive podcast. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
That will do it for this episode of the Think Inclusive podcast. Subscribe to the Think Inclusive podcast via Apple Podcasts, the Anchor app, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Have a question or comment? Email us your feedback at podcast@thinkinclusive.us. We love to know that you're listening. Thank you to patrons Veronica E., Sonia A., Pamela P., Mark C., Kathy B., and Kathleen T. for their continued support of the podcast. When you become a patron, your contribution helps us with the cost of audio production, transcription, and promotion of the Think Inclusive podcast. And you could even get a shout out like the fine people we just mentioned. Go to patreon.com/thinkinclusivepodcast to become a patron today and get access to all our unedited interviews, including our conversation with Howard Shane. Thank you for helping us equip more people to promote and sustain inclusive education. This podcast is a production of MCIE, where we envision a society where neighborhood schools welcome all learners and create the foundation for inclusive communities. Learn more at mcie.org. We will be back in a couple of weeks with our interview with Anthony Ianni, author of the book Centered: Autism, Basketball, and One Athlete's Dreams. Thank you for your time and attention. And until next time, remember, inclusion always works.